Hello there, friends, and welcome back to Artist Questions. This is the mostly weekly live stream where we look at some of what I think are the biggest questions facing contemporary artists today. My name is Dan Curtis. I'm an artist and writer and head of education at Exchange Art, who make all of this possible. Thank you so much for joining me again today. I've been away for the last few weeks with the old autumn holidays and been enjoying some time with my son off school, which is great. Doing Minecraft, printmaking, drawing, all sorts of wonderful things. And I'm glad to be back with you to discuss this week's question, which is a bit of a follow on actually from the question that we looked at um, before this episode in before the holidays, which was can curiosity survive the art world? And this week we're looking at the question, do artists need a style to be successful? This is a really cool question, I think, because it touches not just on ideas around what it means to be an artist, but also ideas on why an artist is viewed a certain way, or how we might have strange kind of falsehoods around what we think we're supposed to be doing as an artist, or how we're supposed to be behaving as an artist. So, as usual with this kind of thing, I want to first kind of look at the idea of style, where it's come from, the word itself, and what it might mean for us now, not just taking it as a given that we all understand what style is, and then break that down a little bit, look at why I think elements of the understanding around style can be unhelpful, and also what parts can be helpful, and then finish as usual with a little reframing, a way that we can go away and hopefully apply some of these ideas in a more ethical and enriching way, so that you can get more in tune with a stronger art practice. So let me just close this one here. The chat is open as usual on YouTube and on X, so feel free to drop any questions, comments, disagreements, angry statements, statements of love and joy and acceptance, or whatever you feel is relevant to this conversation. So let's have a look at the term style. Style itself, the word, the etymology, I'm just going to pull up here. I was looking at this earlier. It has a Latin root, as most of these things do when it comes to kind of Western art history. And the Latin root, as probably most of you could guess, relates to the word stylus, or an instrument for writing. That's the kind of Latin root. It then went on through the Middle Ages to refer to a kind of broad range of writing instruments, and then from there took on this evolution of meaning, which went from a kind of physical tool to the act of writing itself, and the act of writing down one's thoughts or ideas, and then to a distinctive manner of writing or handwriting, i.e., your style of writing, right? And then the figurative extension was built on that in I guess, the late 1800s, by what I'm seeing here, and was coming to be more understood as not just the writing, but a way of writing, a unique or characteristic way of writing that then became a unique and characteristic way of doing something, and then extended to all other forms of expression, including fashion, art, even behavior. And I think now, right up to date, we see it in, I think, almost every aspect of cultural life. A footballer's style of play, a Pokemon card players style of gaming, everything like that. What is the style of this computer game, etc., etc. I think we can see it almost everywhere. What style of music do you like, etc. It also links to the term mannerisms or manner, the manner of which you do something, and we'll come to that in a minute as we look at more history. But the word manner in its Latin root is related to the hand, which is intrinsically connected to the stylus. And the word art itself is related to the word arm. So, like done by the arm, by the hand. So, there's this constant sort of drawback to the individual doing this thing in a certain way. And that is quite important, I think, in terms of a Western view of what art is. It's like it's engaged in the single person, yeah, a style by them, something that is recognizable as them and their unique characteristic. And I think that's where some of the difficulty lies, but also some of the positivity as well. Another thing that branches off, no pun intended here, as you'll see in a minute. Don't know, I can't believe I said that when you hear what this is about. But another way that the Latin root works is that there is the phrase to stake, or like a stick, put a stick in the ground, connected to the term stylus, also comes up in its Latin origin. So I think there's something interesting there to be said about like staking something. This is who I am. This is my unique way of doing something, expressing something. This is my style. And I think, again, I want to challenge that as well in a bit. So that's the kind of etymology. Let's look at the sort of art historical, philosophical side of things. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of this book by Giorgio Vasari. It's called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. It's seen, when was it written? I don't actually know. Let's see. Okay, it was written in 1550, so a substantially early work. And it was published in 2 volumes, and it was kind of, I guess it's considered as the sort of foundational style and idea for how Western art history thinks about what artists do and what they are and who they are, particularly around individuality and style. It was historically one of the first books that gathered together an artist's life as well as and their character and their manner, let's say, of exploration, as well as just like, what had been done or groups of people working on single things together. It began to look at artists' entire lives as something worth writing about and worth getting to know. And in an early way, I guess it's like the first art Instagram in some sense as well, or the first art Wikipedia, these short sort of pithy understandings about this person's quirkiness or individuality, as well as the stuff that they're making. And it's interesting in that there's a quote from the book here. I've just picked one out here. There's, which is quite interesting in terms of this idea of style, is having learned one style from his putative master, the young artist moves to Florence. He fashions himself anew. The style he achieves is more than a personal style. It is something like a super style or a meta style. So again, we're talking about the idea of developing oneself beyond what you've been taught into this thing that kind of encompasses your whole life. This then on from here is connected, this term mannerism, as I was discussing earlier, and manner related to the word hand. And this became popular in the 18th century to define 16th century artists, so those that were coming after Vasari's writings. the major kind of after the major Renaissance masters, I guess. And it's that again, this term was starting to grow in popularity, the manner or style in which someone was working, and was then becoming increasingly tied to Western art historical periods and the notion of the individual manner or the individual way of doing things. So, sort of from Vasari, it develops further and further away from, groups of artists or people learning from the people before them and into like this first way of like being an individual. Um, I guess what's interesting to think about in terms of this is that idea of a recognizable style of the individual is an extremely Western point of view in terms of not just um, the way that we're presented with this sort of information, but also in the way that people understand what art history is and sort of take for granted that this is what art is. Not even just Western art history, but art itself is about usually great kind of white men, one after the other, making this new, original, um, innovative artwork that expresses something of their unique ability. But that isn't always the case in terms of understanding how Western art is portrayed. And then in other areas of the world, it can be seen as completely different. So I wanted to bring up something here that I thought was interesting, um, in that um, in many pre-modern art traditions, style or something akin to that would have, let's say, pre-Vasari would have um, referred to a kind of a region or a workshop or a guild kind of identity, not the individual's self-expression. Yeah. So in medieval Europe, artists were more like anonymous craftspeople working in workshops or monasteries. And then you get the style of the region. Yeah, that's the style that you're working in, or the style of the workshop, the Byzantine tradition, let's say, for example, the Sienese school of iconography, etc. Style then was much more seen as communal and functional, not as a kind of personal sense of brand or expression. And then, akin to that, in many non Western art traditions, and we have to keep coming back to this, that Western art history is sometimes presented as world history, as if that it's central and everything else is just around that. But that isn't the case. Um, and so, in many non Western art traditions, in fact, individuality or that sense of style was completely downplayed or actually just irrelevant, altogether. Think about classical Chinese, Japanese, Islamic art. A kind of sense of mastery would usually mean continuing a lineage or perfecting a form from what's being handed down to you in the group, a shared grammar that, there could be innovation within that, but it was subtle. It was the moving forward of the communal idea, not sort of branded originality, or what we understand or what style has become today, a kind of marker of belonging instead of distinction. And that's why it's an absolute pain in the ass for many, let's say, archivists of Japanese art to find out who made the certain prints, because it might not be that this one person did it, because actually there might be 10 people all acting within the group in this shared name. And it's funny how, in a kind of other sense, that the way that it's flipped around now to still be a lot of people, let's say Damien Hirst's massive factory of people making art for him, but it's done under his one name, as if he did everything. So the maintaining of style and brand is so important, regardless of actually what's happening in a group sense. So then on from there, Renaissance, Romanticism, that really was then that change into the artistic individual. So the kind of artists that um, Vasari was writing about, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Dürer, they begin to sign their work with their own names. So we're kind of going back to the stylus, the pen in a funny way. And this is seen as kind of revolutionary. And then this period gives us the idea that the artist's hand or vision should be identifiable from others. And then actually in the Romantic era, that then gets kind of doubled down, and the artist becomes a singular visionary, a genius myth begins to emerge, expressing inner truth. And that makes kind of the birth of the style of as selfhood, as your style equals you, your identity, your soul, and your character in some sense as an artist is all like, bundled into that. So then that's looking at kind of the beginning in terms of Western art history in particular. But let's look, and then I think it's worth understanding as well, even with that frame of mind, and even in a kind of looking at that deep sort of romantic drive for singular visionary expression through the person, even then, with that becoming a bigger thing, it's still not a truth. So there's a great book, I'm sure many of you have read before, called Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. Highly recommend getting it if you haven't. It's like a little simple tabletop, wonderful book full of drawings and ideas, very accessible. And he talks a lot about the idea of Beethoven being seen as this kind of arbiter of style, and his style is, new, and his identity and his personal self-expression. But the fact that Beethoven, and this goes for all big artists now, Beethoven is not on his own. Beethoven is the brand of him, but all around him are his funders, his backers, his trainers, people who supported him, his people who are pushing the music out, his people who are getting him the gigs, all that kind of stuff. Beethoven doesn't exist as this kind of solo entity genius doing everything. There is a whole team around Beethoven to make him work, and still now. And then bringing it more, I guess, into the last 100 years, history has gone up and down, up and down. And this is not just Western history, but, world history has gone up and down with this sort of idea of individualism and, expressing oneself as an individual. And then the collective, collective action. And as the kind of struggle for power throughout all of history has been maintained in various forms, these at different times based on different kind of world changing events. I think individualism and then group activity has kind of taken precedent more or not. So, in post-war America, abstract expressionism began to get very big, and a lot of that was because it was being pushed by, the American government, as a kind of antithesis to what they were seeing as like communism or something like that, which would have been about group understanding and like trying to push things forward, or socialism or something like that, trying to do things together. Whereas, abstract expressionism can be kind of boiled down to a very, very particular focus on a singular person and their kind of great genius. So Jackson Pollock is a great example of that. And, there was all the sort of photo shoots done of him like painting with a cigarette in his mouth, and he's like very macho looking, and a lot of this was pushed out because it was seen as bringing America back to some sort of masculine solo lone wolf roots, and rather than this like the breaking down of the nuclear family or something like that, or that socialism was starting to say that gender roles weren't necessarily applied in this way, and actually we need to be more unified, not individuals. And so you can see that out of a political and capitalist framework, things like style turn into a way of identifying what's right in the world or what's politically correct to do. So in terms of modernism then and the market, that sort of recognizability then turns also into a currency. So, by the 19th and 20th century, galleries, critics, collectors were beginning to shape taste by looking at style from its political function, but also from its market function. A signature style then not only becomes a way of sort of identifying an artist, but becomes a brand. And that's where the kind of the more obvious link with capitalism and the market begins to emerge in art, in that we're not now looking at groups of people under one name, like the Byzantine school, like we were saying, who are kind of working in a monastery and they're commissioned by the church. We're not getting that anymore, and we are breaking now into this ground where post impressionism, we're even moving out of the idea of schools and things like that, like Impressionism, and moving more and more to the individual artists as their own kind of art history, their own art world. And so what started then as that romantic notion of the self-expression being the most important thing turns into sort of an economic strategy. So recognizability, therefore, a repeated style which you can equate to a singular person, equals like a stability of something that you can invest in rather than like a group, for example. And that's not to say that's all bad, but it's definitely to say that that is not everything. In many other cultures, this idea still of a unique branded style as an artist remains completely alien. If you think about a lot of indigenous work, Africans, Pacific Islanders work, Asian traditions, the art is relational, it's ceremonial, it's not about personal selfhood expression. um, you might have kind of variation within the mastery and what's being passed down, but there isn't this sense of ownership of a look. And I'm not saying that that then makes that art better or something like that, but what I am saying is that it does mean that as kind of artists in the West here, or going into the art world, which is built on these Western values of style and personal kind of currency, that can be actually quite a trap for us as artists when we get stuck in that mode of thinking, I must understand what my personal style is and never deviate from it, otherwise the market won't understand me. So that's what I want to focus on next, so let's get more into that. So on the positive side, there are joys of the idea of having an originality or a solo style, and particularly now with the kind of flattening of the democratic idea of around the art world, there is less of a need now to have a gallery to move your art forward. There's less of a way of being able to get access only through certain tastemakers, although that's still very much a thing. As I talked about kind of at length in my collector's art course, which is on YouTube, if you want to go back and watch that on the Healthy Artist YouTube channel. And but outside of that, there still is this there is this ability now, through social media, through our newsletters, through a command of the internet, through a good way of kind of marketing yourself, to be able to have a style and a way of doing things that is unique to you and doesn't require other people to make that happen, which is, that's got to be seen as a positive in many ways. And it's great when we can shape something around the things that we want to do. I think the problem is with that's often not the way that we think about style. I think that the idea of style actually stunts experimentation and your growth in becoming an artist. So this links really, you know, back really strongly back to what I was talking about in the last episode about curiosity, where curiosity can feel like some kind of indulgence. And I think because we haven't got time, or we're not really allowed to do that, we've got to be serious, we've got to be focused. And then I think the idea of style feeds into that. The idea, well, but if I did this, would people understand that it was still me? Would people recognize it? And I remember going through this exact thing when I went onto my master's course, uh, which I was really thankful to get, a scholarship to be able to do. And coming there, I kind of thought like, okay, this is like the serious bit of study now. I'm going to be able to kind of polish my brand in a way. I wasn't putting it in those terms, but that's kind of how I was thinking it like. And then so when the tutors were challenging me about, well, why not make this? Why not try that? Why not work in that material? I kept coming up against this kind of thought, which was like, yeah, but is that me? Is that my style? Um, and is that what Dan Curtis would do? And I'm trying to like imagine it in my head, like under my name, my brand, or something like that. And what it's doing is constantly like stopping me from exploring things like that I don't understand. So, challenging myself with new ideas, exploring nuance. And that is because style now inevitably gets so much looped in with brand that it becomes about capitalism. And therefore, like we said, with curiosity, being choked by capitalism and feeling like there's no space or time or money for you to explore, because how are people going to understand and purchase from you or something like that? Style then reinforces that same idea, I think. I think another issue with this idea of constantly shaping ourselves around a brand and a style, um, and I'm not against brand, by the way. I did an episode on that, should artists brand themselves? And we really thought about that in terms of welcoming people into your story, yeah, and what it is that you're trying to do. I think the difference between that and what style is doing here is saying the story is fixed. The story can only look this one way, and it better always look the same, otherwise no one's going to buy from you or something, or get it or something like that. I think also then when it comes to thinking about style in the way that it turned through, the Renaissance into the Romantic era into modernism, is that it is almost like viewing every part of what you do as your style. And then I think it becomes that every part of your artistic life kind of gets infected with that. And then you can't think in any other way apart from what's sellable, what's brandable, what's monetizable, what's worth doing to reinforce my style, how do I find my thing, etc., etc. Is this me? And it reminds me of a chapter in Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, amazing book. And he talks about how quite a few companies moved away from like a 9 to 5 structure to not having any hours at all within the company. And that as long as you do the work, that they trust you to get on with it, and you can do it whenever, whatever time, and come in whenever or work from home whenever. And that's sort of marketed and seen as like, really like an authentic and amazing way of approaching office life or work. But the problem is when there's no framework to the hours that you need to spend, then all of life becomes the possibility to become work. All hours are work. And then work has colonized every area of your life, where you're constantly thinking, I could be working now, instead of like you've got some differentiation between making, things for capitalism and then trying to be out of that in some sense. And I think for an artist it's even harder, because the idea of your entire life being you as an artist and your style gets so wrapped up in the whole thing that sometimes there's not an easy way to differentiate between what is my art and what is me, or what is the monetizable, the brandable, and when does that stop? And it becomes really difficult, especially now in an attention economy, where well, if you think about it in terms of intention economy, and say something like Instagram or TikTok or YouTube thrives on recognizability and repeatability. And we talked about this with curiosity last time. Capitalism needs things to be the same over and over and easily accessible, but also it needs new things to come in, but then it needs those things to be repeated over and over until they kind of collapse. And then the idea that, as we discussed last time, is this phrase I've been constantly thinking about, which is that you can't build a brand around nuance. And I think I find that so helpful, because the way that a lot of attention economy applications like Instagram are shaped is in this need for things to be exactly the same. And it doesn't reward the idea of, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I'm doing 10 different things, or I'm trying different stuff out, or I've got a wider scope to my practice. It rewards, oh, you're the guy who does the spin paint thing, whatever, like that, right? And I'll get a t-shirt from you, and I'll do this, that, and the other, and it's like, you're the person that does that. And it reduces things so into such small chunks. Now, of course, you could have multiple profiles and things going on, but then what happens is we get thinking that that's what art is as a whole, instead of that's what it means to make art in this area. So in a way, when you ask the question, do artists need to have a specific style to be successful? The answer, in a way, is kind of like yes, but if you want to be successful in this very narrow definition of what you think art is, like attention economy, branded self, yeah, if you want that fame and success in that area, then yes, you have to absolutely have a style that's recognizable, brandable. Oh, you're the lines guy, you're the paper planes woman, or whatever else. It's got to be clear, otherwise because the app is not slow enough for people to be able to accept nuance. And that's not the fault of the user, that is how the app is designed. I think then as well, style has become so much a part then through the attention economy, and the way that we view so much of culture, that actually style has infected every area of culture, like I said earlier, like a football style or something like that. And I think then so much of it comes down to like, oh, he's the guy that does this. And that means we end up sort of reducing people to small sort of slivers of the idea of what a self is. And it's like a reduction and compartmentalizing and a taxonomy of all people, of all life, of all culture, and then for us as artists, of our entire art practice. But the taxonomy of life and culture and our art is just so unhealthy, I think, for us as artists. Not everything needs to be grounded and labeled into these uniquely sellable sections, because all that does is get you constantly in the space of not being able to experiment and play and be open, which is not, for none of us, the reason why we wanted to be artists in the first place, is to categorize ourselves in very clear styles and then market that. Who the fuck is wanting to do that, as an artist? Of course, there's different types of art where you might want to do something that is more like repeatable, but even then, experimentation still needs to have a space to emerge. Okay, so how then might we reframe this as a way of closing? A thing that I have always found really helpful is the idea of not viewing my art and my practice as a style. So, in fact, I hate the word style. I push away from it. I think it's nonsense. The whole idea is nonsense. And instead, I've found the best word that I want to encourage artists to use about their practice is something that I learned from my podcast co-host, Martha Lamont, and that is the word territory. And I think that's a much more helpful way of framing your practice than what is my style, which is kind of boiling down to singular entity. Instead, what is my territory, my map, my strata? Where am I, operating within my territory? And what you'll find is when you start looking at your work in terms of territory, you will stop being in a position where you're thinking, oh, is that me? Because yes, of course it's you, because it's within it's within your territory. Yeah. So, or even like within your alphabet or something like that is another way of putting it. So I think when I make video art and also sound pieces and digital stuff and drawings and printmaking and sculpture and performance and these talks now and my essay work that I do and then my visual essays, all of that for me is within my territory. I don't now view it as, oh no, but like, should I do that? Or should I set up a different Instagram account? Or should I constantly thinking about like, will people understand it? If it's not one clear, presentable thing. Instead, I think my territory is what I'm exploring. And then what I want you to get better at as an artist is finding ways of exploring that territory by bashing down the idea of style. There was this game when I was younger called Total Annihilation. This is going to make sense in a minute. I wasn't really a big gamer growing up. I just used to kind of play free stuff that a friend gave me, or something that I'd managed to buy with some pocket money or something. But we did have a PC in our house when the internet came around, and I got this game called Total Annihilation, and it's basically like deep dystopian future where humans have their consciousness is able to be put into machines, but then the humans who don't want that are trying to fight against the machines who are trying to control them, right? And so you're trying to totally annihilate the other team, right? But the way you do that is through building up these sort of small armies of houses and robots and those kind of things. And the map was basically like a black square in the corner. Yeah. And where you started was sort of revealed to you. And as you kind of drove a little plane this way or moved forward, the map would reveal itself more to you. And so you'd kind of start drawing in the darkness until eventually you'd explored so much of this territory that you now had a fuller understanding of where you were. It didn't mean that, everything was fixed. You continued to grow and explore. But if you stayed within that very small area of territory, you were prone to kind of being attacked by the enemy at all sides, right? Because you couldn't see what else was around you. And I was thinking about that as a little analogy this morning when I was thinking about this in terms of like, we need to get more confident in going beyond our little area of the map, which we're like, this is my style, this is me. And then breaking out through experimentation, through exploring the landscape and knowing that we're still in the map. You still will be in the map. You're not by going over here being like, I've abandoned myself. I've abandoned style. Nothing's going to make sense anymore. I'm not allowed to try that because that's not me. You'll still be within the map because you are you making all your stuff. Yeah. If you think about, one of the most famous painters still alive at the moment is Gerhard Richter. And if you think about his practice, he has got these incredible, beautiful, large scale abstract works. And then he also makes highly photorealistic paintings. And then he also makes things that are in between those two things. And the quality of his territory and his exploration and his understanding of his territory is, in a sense, like bashed through the market to say, this is what I'm doing, and he's much older now. He's in his 90s, and maybe there is a kind of previous way of looking at his work that allows that to occur. Whereas with some other artists, it might be much harder to do that these days because, it's not recognizable. But there's to be said that, that for me is a much more interesting practice than someone who makes the same sculpture over and over and over for the rest of their life. And not by, I mean, like is inquiring into one subject, but is kind of like recasting. It's a bit like, I know people love Anthony Gormley, the British artist, and he has been exploring the kind of the body, you know, his whole career, and he has a territory within that, which is great. But a lot of his shows these days are often recasts of the casts of he made of his body when he was like 20, you know, and he's in his like 70s now, and you think, let it go a bit. Do you know what I mean? Like, the style has become so synonymous with those early casts being like famous, that that's his style, that if a museum can kind of rinse and repeat that early success of the late 90s and early 2000s or whatever, then that will be kind of showing that they're cultured or something. But the work's past, you know, it's good work, but it's not brand new, you know. And I think that, yeah, it might not be his fault. It might be the way that, you know, his estate is managed, and the way that he has, you know, 10 shows on at the same time all over the world. So, you know, if people want to keep showing those same things, maybe they do have to make 100 of them so different people can have a show at the same time. But again, it's always frustrated me when I come into a room and I'm like, Anthony Gormley, here's another cast of his body as a 20-year-old, you know, that they've just wheeled out again. And I just think, yeah, explore the map. You know, maybe the institution is to explore the map. So that's what I want to leave you with today. Total annihilation of the future. I want to leave you with this. You forget style, because and think about territory. Don't be afraid to experiment and explore because you think it's not you. Forget that. That's just an Western, you know, modernist romantic overhang, which, yes, still controls so much of what we understand about art, but that isn't what art is. That isn't everything. Yeah. For you, find your territory, push into those dark areas and let them become lighter, you know, and let that become part of your territory. Thank you for joining me this week, friends, and I will see you next Wednesday, same time, same place. Bye bye now.